delighted to have all of you this morning for a session on regional dynamics. And why this session? Because I am struck when I talk to people around the world how the world is very connected. Any news goes around the world in a matter of minutes, but at the same time the perspectives are quite different from one part of the world to the other. And this combination is a challenge for all of us. Now, of course, for the Europeans and for many, what's happening in Ukraine is the dominant news of the moment, and I'm very happy that we have with us Andriy Shevchenko, who is both a diplomat, a journalist, also an activist. I mean, he was very instrumental in developing the fifth channel at the time of Maidan. Later, he was ambassador to Canada, so he bridges, in a way, he's a connection between the world of public institutions and the world of civil society. And I have no doubt on what is foremost on his mind. It's, of course, the war that is devastating his country. But it's not absolutely obvious that for every continent, it's the same thing. So usually I would ask a different question to each panelist, but I think for this panel, it's interesting to ask in a way the same question. What is at the top of your agenda? And of course, since we know the answer for Andriy, I will add a question for him, which will be, what is at the top of the agenda? We know what's at the top of your agenda, but how can you make it something that is at the top of the agenda for the rest of the world? Because there are many other issues, from climate change to regional conflicts. The regional dynamics are very different from one part of the other, and I'm very pleased in that regard to have Haile Menkerios, who has worked a lot on the African continent, who works particularly on the Horn of Africa at the moment. And if there is a part of Africa where regional dynamics are intertwined with local dynamics and global dynamics, certainly the Horn is the example. And then there is, of course, Asia, which has its own issues, and where there is certainly a desire not to be engulfed in a polarized world. And there's, of course, the shadow of China that looms large in that part of the world. And then there is Latin America, and I'm glad that we have Juan Gabriel Valdés, so we have two former foreign ministers, Marty Natalegawa for Indonesia and Juan Gabriel Valdés for Chile, who is now the new ambassador of Chile in Washington. And it'll be interesting also to see what's the perspective from Latin America. So maybe without further ado, I'll ask Juan Gabriel to start and give us his sense from Latin America. What is on the agenda? And you just arrived in the United States. You see what's on the agenda of the United States, but from your own perspective, as the ambassador and former foreign minister of a very important country in Latin America, how do you see the world from your perspective?
Well, I think that, first of all, thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for this invitation, and I'm honored to participate with such distinguished guests. I'm just coming back from Los Angeles, where the Latin American countries had the summit with President Biden and his administration to discuss the situation in the region and the prospects of cooperation. I would say that if you ask me what's on the top of the agenda, I would say that it is COVID and the importance that the COVID epidemic has had on our economies, the situation of our economies as a result of COVID, and also as a result of the conflict and the invasion of Russia or Ukraine has produced in terms of food and the provision of food and the prices of food and fuel has created enormous difficulties in Latin America. Therefore, The hope was that in this summit we could discuss with the United States something similar to what the United States has discussed with for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was proposed after the meeting with the Asian countries a couple of weeks ago, not to say something like what the US has signed with the European Union on trade and on technology recently. Most of the countries of Latin America, as you know, have trade agreements with the United States, but these trade agreements have not resulted in an enormous amount of investment in our region. Therefore, the first question is, how do we solve in countries that are enormously divided by inequality, by social injustice, by a situation of internal division, which is produced not just by the social conditions, but by the political conditions. Countries which are threatened in not only in terms of their political systems, but also in the terms of their democracies and the quality of their democracies. How do we protect these democracies in a context in which to these inequalities has been added the pandemic and the economic impacts that is producing all around the world, the invasion of Russia of Ukraine? This situation is one of the, I would say that this was the main topic that was discussed during the Los Angeles meeting and characterizes the type of discussion that Latin Americans have today. Maybe later I can say what was the result of the summit and how do we see the situation now. But let me say that questions like migration as a result of the situation in the region, particularly in Venezuela. You have to think that 5 million Venezuelans have left the country and most of them have come to Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. The situation of drug trafficking and violence as a result of arms trafficking, and of course the situation of climate change, it was also discussed because it is among the top preoccupations of the Latin American leaders. I wouldn't say, of course, that the summit will solve these problems or will create a rapid or immediate solution to these issues, but it is clear that it opened ways of conversation and discussion with the United States, which are important to follow. Finally, I will say that it was surprising, as all Latin American countries, most of them, we were 31 countries in the meeting from Latin America and the Caribbean. 20 countries protested the exclusion of Cuba from the meeting, which was a clear sign to the United States that after 60 years of blockade, the situation continues to be the same, and these policies have failed, and they do not satisfy the Latin American countries and the Latin American governments. I have made this rapid description because I think that probably it is much more urgent to listen to our friends, particularly to Mr. Shevchenko, on the situation in Ukraine. I have to say that most of the Latin American countries all of them practically have condemned the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine. The Chilean government has been very expressive on that. I would say that with the exception of Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, all the rest have been very explicit in their condemnation of the Russian invasion and in their solidarity with Ukraine. Therefore, there are not clear divisions in the region in terms of the international situation. The region in that sense has a common perspective, and it is important, I have to say it because of course I'm from that country, that the new Chilean leader, the youngest, probably the youngest leader in the world in terms of, in comparison, expressed that his views on this new left coming on in Chile is based on absolute respect to human rights, absolute respect to democratic principles, and absolute respect to the rule of law. And reforms have to be made within this context and within this framework. And of course, this opens a new discussion in the region because this was not the traditional vision of the center left or the left on international politics. Therefore, I think that one of the aspects or one of the topics that was discussed in the summit, the question of human rights, got a new response, a very clear response in terms of Latin America needs enormous change because Latin America cannot survive and the countries cannot survive with democratic system, with the level of division and social division that exists. But at the same time, Latin America cannot make progress without clear respect to human rights and the principles of democracy. This is what I could say, Jean-Marie, at this point.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting, and what you say also on the interaction between the domestic debate on inequalities, on human rights, and the international debate, I think is a feature of our world, where the separation between internal politics and domestic politics is less and less relevant in a way. I will give the floor, I'll give the last word in this first round to Andriy Shevchenko, but I think it's interesting to first hear the various continents. And so I will next ask Haile Menkerios to give us his perspective from Africa.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Me too, Haile. Your initiative. Hopefully, it would be a constant feature in the future as well. On top of the agenda in Africa, and there are too many actually that are very high on the agenda, on the African agenda. But instead of repeating on what is known, let me spell out the more recent ones. One, I think the return of military coups and the causes for that, particularly throughout the Sahel region, is a phenomenon which has been very concerning, which is new again. And the African Union not being able really to contain the recurrence of such violent and unconstitutional changes of government, I think is one issue that is preoccupying African countries. More on the economic aspect, because of the Ukraine war, there has been increase in the cost of food and oil, and this has hit the economies of every African country. 30% of food imports, particularly grain imports, used to come from Ukraine for the entirety of the continent. In some areas more, in some areas a little less, but it's unfortunate. But that a continent which have the land, the water, and the human resources to be self-sufficient and perhaps exporting food production is dependent actually on key food items, in other words, particularly wheat from Ukraine. The second is a result of that, connected with that, the increase in the cost of oil has hit also almost every country. In international investment has not been much, but even whatever existed has sort of been diminished as a result of the overall downturn, economic downturn globally also. Many used to get support also, financial and otherwise, from particular governments, particularly in the West, and also the international organizations, and this has been very much diminished as well. Now, what exactly is Africa trying to do? What are the Africans saying, actually, or planning to do with this? Number one, I think those in North Africa and perhaps in Southern Africa, including Tanzania and some others, that have oil probably will increase production in oil and trying to make big gains as a result of this. Prices in oil. There is also talk about raising both domestic, that is African, and international investment in agriculture, perhaps not only to cover the shortcomings, the shortages now, but to capitalize on the advantages of land and adequate rain in several countries in Africa. There is, of course, an increasing discussion within African countries that, irrespective of how they voted at the UN regarding Ukraine, which was very checkered, some actually supporting, very few supporting Russia because they are politically dependent, and many, however, being abstaining, in other words, not voting or being absent even. There is an increasing discussion within African countries that they should not be in any way associated with the West or the East when it comes to this conflict, which has global consequences. Much can be said about that, but the tendency is in that direction, that Africa should, as much as possible, ensure stability within Africa in order to attract investment away from the extractive industries to manufacturing. Although there isn't much coming, there is much talk about increasing inter-African trade, inter-African relations, in other words, effectually sort of pursuing this African free trade zone within Africa itself. But that is a long shot. It has been there on the agenda. There is just now increased discussion on how Africa could mitigate the result of the conflict, the international conflict that has arisen as a result of Ukraine. Let me stop there. Just the view, and then later on, perhaps, if there are any discussions, there are, of course, conflicts as in Africa, also besetting.
Thank you very much, Haile. And it's extraordinary how just as you were finishing, the picture disappeared, at least on my, oh no, it's still there? Okay, well, so that's my computer. Oh, yes, and you're back, yeah. But thank you very much for your remarks. I'm going to turn to Marty Natalegawa, so to give us a perspective from Indonesia and Asia.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Thank you for the kind invitation to take part in this morning's here in the States discussion. Naturally, I should like to begin by, apart from expressing appreciation, confirm that what I share, the views are entirely my own personal view and does not represent the view of any other entities with whom I may be associated. Clearly, it would be impossible in the limited time that we have to describe or much less analyze deeply the various issues of priority of concern in the region, in Southeast Asia or in the wider Indo-Pacific region. And therefore, there is always the risk of oversimplification and skewed priorities in whatever I'm about to share. That taken into account, I'd like to highlight some issues and perhaps better still, hopefully, give a reason why I cite those issues in terms of the conceptual significance of those issues. The first two is what others have mentioned before as well. I think for all governments and societies in Southeast Asia, the pandemic remains and its various manifestations in terms of consequence remains a primary concern, especially nowadays. Less the public health issue because the situation has become more manageable compared to recent past, but more in terms of the economic consequence and the efforts to promote economic recovery hopefully post-pandemic. And naturally, the developments in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has added additional difficulties in terms of the economic recovery efforts. So I think all across in the region, the pandemic, the vulnerable or fragile economic recovery efforts remain a high priority issue. But I think if one reflects on it, it's not only the pandemic, the current pandemic and the global economic recovery efforts is a symptom of an example of a wider conceptual challenge, namely how countries of the region need to address issues that defy national solutions. They are essentially cross-boundary, transboundary, and no doubt in the future, I mean, in the past, we've had issues such as natural disasters that affect all of us, many of us in the region, and we all had to grapple with it. So, one can imagine a situation in the future where issues such as climate change, etc., again reminds that there is a need for the diplomatic tool and wherewithal and not least of all, the policy leadership needed to deal with issues that cross boundaries and that defy national solutions. Not only that, I think the pandemic and the global economic recovery efforts in our region reminds of a broader concept of security. Security clearly now, one uses the term sometimes human security to describe this phenomenon. In some ways, there is a reminder for our region that it is not only security in the most traditional, limited term that we have to grapple with, but in a more fundamental way to the welfare of the individual, even in a way. Aside from the pandemic and the economic efforts, recovery efforts, I'd like to take up on the theme that you had mentioned before, Jean-Marie, about the nexus or the convergence of internal and external, and our part of the world, Southeast Asia. When you think about it, a lot of the issue that had taxed us in the past are essentially internal in nature, and that quickly obtain extra national dimension, becomes regional and beyond the region, even when the conflicts in the so-called Indochina region before, and in Cambodia, and now obviously in Myanmar, the internal situation in Myanmar is having regional ramifications, the outflow of refugees and the violations of democratic principles that ASEAN member states have subscribed to. So clearly, this type of internal and yet regional ramifications situations such as Myanmar is now becoming a litmus test for the ASEAN's effectiveness and relevance. And thankfully, this time around, actually, the rest of the world is giving ASEAN the opportunity and the space to work on this portfolio, on this issue. And I must say that in the evidence so far has been rather underwhelming, to say the least, because we have not had much progress as expected, but hopefully there is some kind of a quiet diplomacy and efforts being undertaken elsewhere. So Myanmar is important for us, but more as an example of the point that you have been saying, Jean-Marie, in terms of how internal can quickly obtain regional ramifications. The more traditional type of concern, security concerns, is we have plenty of them about in our region. Our region has a sufficient number of unresolved territorial disputes. South China Sea is especially prominent, and other bilateral type of territorial disputes. But on the whole, thanks to the visions and the anticipations of leaders past, there are many modalities to address these issues. Even on the South China Sea, there is an ASEAN-China track to manage the potential for conflict. But in many cases, these diplomatic tracks have become disconnected from the reality on the ground. We have efforts that's coming up with the so-called Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, but the reality on the ground or at sea is there is a constant effort by one of the party, at least in the South China Sea, to change the facts on the ground, so to speak. So the South China Sea and other territorial disputes obviously an issue of concern to us, especially how to prevent unintended conflicts in terms of miscalculation. I don't think our part of the world suffers from the potential of an overt aggression, because there is on the whole a sense of a security community in this part of the world, but there is a real risk of miscalculation where minor incident can quickly be flat up to become a more serious one as a result. And there is a need, therefore, to have a crisis management capacity in this regard. All this, obviously, my final point, is taking place against the background of very intensified so-called major power rivalries in a part of the world. Not only US-China, I hasten to add, but also we have India and Pakistan's dynamic. We have Australia and United States, with China, on the other hand, in parts of the Pacific. In Northeast Asia, we have obviously the situation on the Korean Peninsula, the complicated dynamics between Japan and China, Japan and Korea, or Republic of Korea even. So, there is a push and pull, is the norm in our part of the world. But in the past, countries of Southeast Asia have been very able to navigate these very complex dynamics in a very nuanced, calibrated manner, seeking equilibrium in our part of the world, rather than necessarily a Cold War type of balance and containment. And therefore, but it is a constant challenge for the region, obviously. On Ukraine, just very quickly, there is a common view in terms of rejection of violations of fundamental principles such as territorial integrity and inviolability of territories and the like. So that is a principle on which countries all ASEAN countries rally around. But in terms of the overall inclination is much like in Africa, where there is hesitancy in trying to become embroiled in the push and pull. But I think in terms of principle, there is a very clear expression of support for those principles that's being violated now in Ukraine. Thank you, Jean-Marie. I'm sorry if it's a little bit convoluted. Thank you.
No, not convoluted. It just will reflect the complexity of our world, where there are many conflicting push and pulls, as you say.
Yeah.
So very useful on the contrary. Now I'll turn to Andriy Shevchenko. So you have heard our colleagues from around the world. What's your reaction to that, and what's the case you want to make?
Well, thank you very much, dear friends and excellencies. Well, I do hear that there is no need to explain what is happening in Ukraine. I'll just start with reading the headlines from today. The first one is this, and I'll try to show you the way it looks. Macron, Scholz, and Draghi are visiting Kyiv one day before the EU Commission's decision on Ukraine's candidacy for the European Union. Second, 50 ministers of defense concluded their meeting in Brussels on military aid to Ukraine. 20% of the world population will be affected by the food shortages because of the war in Ukraine. Every day, Ukraine loses around 1,000 soldiers dead or wounded. And this shows us the complexity, the interconnectivity, the scale, and the tragedy of the world today. And after what we just heard from my fellow co-panelists, who knows what we should call regional today? I think there are no clear boundaries for that anymore. I'll start with 3 points. My first point is that we should be prepared that today every conflict or every challenge might quickly escalate to global consequences. Even before the Russian full-scale invasion started, we had been warning the world that the consequences would immediately spill over the borders of Ukraine, and that's exactly what is happening. There are obvious and very physical threats to the countries that Russia might choose to target militarily. And we're not just talking about Poland or the Baltic countries or Sweden or Finland, which feel it's about their existential safety. But even if you're geographically farther, you're not fully protected from the Russian cyber attacks in New York or chemical attacks in Salisbury, UK, and so on. Of course, the refugee crisis, at least 4 million Ukrainians have left the country in the first months of invasion. Food security, which has already been mentioned many times today, and the global economy slowdown. All of that is the price we are paying for the meltdown of the international order. And I would say it's the price we are paying for the meltdown and weakness of the global diplomacy. And this takes me to my second point. The world today is not prepared for such challenges. We're witnessing the time when the old school diplomacy cannot solve the problems. I wanted to show you this picture and hope this time it works. I run Media Center Ukraine, which works for foreign journalists, and we have 3 locations in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv. And in the city of Lviv, we are situated, we are located in a brewery. So it's quite a good place in the times of peace. And right now, so they never brewed a non-alcoholic beer in this local brewery. The war has changed many things, and they have come up with this first ever non-alcoholic beer of their production, and it looks like this. And it's called UN Beer, and for many Ukrainians, the United Nations is something, and the whole international system of diplomacy and international order today sounds as something weak, misleading, and sorry to say, useless. This is what many people in Ukraine feel about the United Nations system, which was designed to prevent wars from happening. And with Russia sitting on the Security Council and enjoying the veto right, the system will look useless. You can have dozens of UN agencies doing very good job, but if you fail in big things, all the rest is in vain. And moreover, the same goes not just to the specific international institutions, but to the diplomacy in general. In 1993, we signed this Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and the big powers, including US, UK, and France, guaranteed our territorial integrity. But how did it help us in 2015 when Russia invaded Crimea and Donbass? So we are not alone, but we do feel very lonely when it comes to this sort of issues. And this takes me to my third and final point. My biggest hope today is or lies with the growing role of public opinion in the international politics. I think it's quite clear that in the 21st century, governments have to do what their people demand. We know that Mr. Macron and Mr. Scholz spent their last night on this train from Poland to Kiev, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And I think I have a picture, quick picture to show that. Yes, right here. So this is, we see the three great European leaders traveling on this night train from Poland to Kiev, and they are putting their lives in danger, in risk. As I speak to you, we are under airstrike warning in Kiev. We just missed the airstrike sirens, and it's the third one in this one day in Kiev. And it's clearly that the Russians are sending their signals to the European leaders coming to visit Kiev. So my point is that these people have to come to Ukraine and have to do what they do because that's what their people want from them. We have polls showing enormous public support for Ukraine when it comes to military aid, EU membership, not just in the US and Canada, but also in Germany, Italy, France. Those are the countries where Russia traditionally has been quite successful in terms of propaganda. So public opinion has become a feasible and very real impact on the major foreign policy decisions, and there are good and bad sides to that. But for nations like mine, this is the biggest hope today. We do hope that under pressure from broad public, key governments will make the right decisions. And I saved one headline for the end. Yesterday, as of yesterday, 30,000 refugee Ukrainian high school graduates have signed up for the entry test with Ukrainian universities. It means that those kids right now in France or in Poland or in Germany, but they want to take this test this summer and they hope to continue their education in Ukraine. And for people like myself, this is a big, big sign of hope. That means that sometimes the headlines bring some good news to us and not just those bad and terrible news that we are so tired of.
Well, thank you very much for these powerful words. Listening to all of you, it's quite obvious that there are very different perspectives, as I suggested at the beginning, but at the same time, there is a common thread in the desire to restore the role of diplomacy, to restore the role of institutions so that they are not irrelevant. You had a rather, Mr. Shevchenko, you had a rather punchy picture of this new UN beer. So I'm tempted to ask our panelists, how do you salvage the notion of norms, both in domestic and international? I say both domestic and international because both Haile Menkerios and Marty Natalegawa have stressed, for instance, in the case of Haile, the proliferation of coups in Africa. Marty Nataligawa referred to Myanmar. Juan Gabriel Valdés referred to the inequalities in Latin America and the connection between those inequalities and maybe not enough investment and the need to address that in an international way. So we see issues that are intertwined between the domestic and the international. And I would add that at the moment, as a major economic, I don't know if it will be an economic crisis, but there are a lot of dark clouds on the horizon on the global world economy, with Europe very much affected by the war in Ukraine, inflation quite high in the United States, a sense that the Chinese economy with the fight against COVID is not the engine of growth that it used to be. So when you combine all that, you have a rather ominous picture, and it's clear that there is a need for some kind of coordinated action. But that coordinated action on all fronts, whether it's about norms or whether it's about coordination of economics, would it be possible in the very polarized world we have? I mean, I saw, for instance, when there was a G20 meeting hosted by Indonesia, that, I mean, even there were discussions on who should be there, who shouldn't be there. So we see the practical difficulties of maintaining that kind of global coordination. Maybe we should start in the with the same order, with asking Juan Gabriel first his views and then following.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that the first thing that has to be said about Latin America in this, in the sense of your question, is that the region is utterly divided. It's a region in which presidents do not talk to each other. The pandemic, of course, has been an extraordinary limit to our communications, but I don't think I remember in my already long life a situation in which the president of Argentina and the president of Brazil do not simply meet each other. They don't know each other. They just met in Los Angeles for the first time after years of government of both presidents in Argentina and Brazil. It is the first time in which we see a summit in which Mexico decides not to attend, simply because it doesn't accept the exclusion of Cuba. It is a country, it is a region in which the presence of President Bolsonaro in Brazil threatens all the efforts that are being done in the region on climate change. Therefore, it is a region in which there is no, the trust is not in abundance in Latin America. And this is a new situation. We had in the past a certain search for a common identity and the idea that Latin America had a sort of necessary democratic perception and democratic organization. Today, the failure of democracy is present in many countries in Central America and in the region. I think this is important to say, because if you don't take this into account, it is very difficult to define a global vision of the region. And the main relation of the region with the United States and with China. China is, as you know, has been making an enormous progress in the region. Most of the main countries in the region, and I mentioned Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia even, have China as their main trade partner. And the investments of China in the region are increasing, particularly in areas which are conflictive with the United States, because they refer to technological advance and technological transfer. Therefore, the region is in a very special situation, and probably the best result of the summit was that the Latin Americans began to talk among themselves, which was something that hadn't happened. I was listening to my fellow panelists, and I think that the common vision of COVID as a disaster for our economies is very much generalized in the world. Latin America will go back 10 years in terms of growth and particularly in terms of fight against poverty. The amount of poor people has increased in 15% in most of the countries in the region in the last 2 years. Therefore, we are facing a very, very difficult situation, particularly in a world, in a region which is so divided, as I said, by inequality, and in which this division is not simply a statistical phenomenon. It's something that is happening in the streets, and it's showing a fracture which destroys any institution and threatens democracy in very serious ways in many countries in the region. Therefore, the phenomenon of inflation, the situation of the impact of the prices of food and fuel, and the structural situation in which this phenomenon happens, these phenomena happen in Latin America, are really creating an ominous picture of what is going to happen in the near future with respect to democracy and the stability of institutions. In this context, of course, the situation of the United States is quite complicated because the United States simply has no time for Latin America. It's extremely difficult for the dialogue becomes difficult because the US is centered in other areas which have a priority from the point of view of their foreign policy. But it is clear that the US, and particularly this government, has been doing efforts in order to reopen its long-standing relation with Latin America, and we appreciate that. But it is clear that the main focus of the United States is not in the hemisphere. What we can say from the point of view of the international vision of the region, however, is that I think that the war in Ukraine has shown that the addition to the basic principles of the United Nations, of the principle of territorial integrity, and the rejection of the brutal invasion of Russia, is something that unites most of the Latin American countries, and therefore there is, in that sense, an open dialogue with the countries in Europe and with the United States with respect to this situation. Emphasizing the fact that at the same time that the main tendency in the Latin American governments today is to find some sort of solution and peaceful solution to the war, and not continue in a situation in which peace is something that cannot be seen in the horizon. This is what I would say to your question, Jean-Marie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Haile, you think regional organization, you think the African Union can be more successful in bringing the continent together, or does this, for instance, this epidemic of coups make it more difficult?
Well, the attempt is there anyway. I think increased discussion. What is encouraging is that it is not only the institutions of states, member states, that is the regional organizations like ECOWAS and SADC and others, and the African Union, but intellectuals, African intellectuals, economic, in other words, experts, they seem to be getting together and coming with more common questions regarding in which direction Africa should go. Regarding this conflict, for example, in Ukraine, while many governments have tried to calculate politically what is beneficial to them as governments, the majority of African intellectuals, academic institutions, public opinion, so to speak, was that we must take a stand, of course, to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it is an invasion of one sovereign state by another sovereign state. And if we do not, then we risk to throw the basic foundation of all our international institutions, which are based on the sanctity of sovereign states. But beyond that, we should not be engulfed actually in a north-south if something similar to the Cold War was going to come again, and they see it might be inevitable, that it is not in the interest of Africa to be engulfed in such a conflict with one side or the other. On the economy, they see, for example, how vulnerable African economies are, and therefore they try to see the advantages that Africa has. It's probably the continent with the highest rate of population growth, which is expected to double in just about half a decade, half a century. It is a continent where 70% of the population are less than 30, and therefore it's a young continent. It has resources that are still not fully tapped, and therefore it should try to capitalize on those and push for this integrated market. In other words, the African Common Market actually that the African Union has decided upon, and hopefully attract investment in production because of the advantages that I mentioned before: higher and younger population growing. In other words, it's a labor force, and at the same time, it is a consumer force also. So we should be trying to capitalize on the advantages that Africa has, is what I see coming sort of increased now that the conflicts seem to center, that affect all of us, seem to center actually in the West itself, in the developed world, rather than the third world, which used to be the case before. So that tendency is there. I don't know to what extent actually the institutional capacity of the African Union or the regional organizations will do it. But this public opinion, increasing public opinion, as I said, in the direction of Africa, must look for its advantages in whatever new global situation is going to come up as a result of the disruption of this conflict, is gaining ground, and eventually it will find expression in the institutions such as the AU and other regional organizations as well.
Yeah. Marty, you are the country of Bandung, and both Andriy Shevchenko, now Haile Menkerios, have spoken about public opinion and the importance of public opinion. Do you think that something like the spirit of Bandung will be revived at some point, that there is a wave around the world that could help bring a sort of positive vision? Or are you skeptical about that? I'm not asking you about the regional organization in Asia, because there are sub-regional organizations, but the notion of a regional organization in Asia seems just too complicated.
Well, thank you, Jean-Marie. I thought, some of the concern expressed by others in terms of the place of diplomacy in all the various challenges that we are facing is a pertinent one as well to reflect on, whether it be situation on Ukraine, or whether even when we were dealing with the pandemic, despite the fact on the latter, this is a natural situation for countries to come together to promote dialogue and to promote cooperative partnership. As a matter of fact, we saw instead even the injection of geopolitical concern and dynamics and competition, even on an area where cooperation is seemingly the most natural path to pursue. So I think there is scope and there is a need for many of us to reflect on the changing contours, the changing environment within which the diplomatic profession or statecraft is being promoted, because otherwise we are going to see increasing headwinds and increasing irrelevance of such an effort. I mean, on the internal-external nexus, for instance, I get the point about how public pressures can galvanize and can push governments to be a bit more assertive and all that. But at the same time, for the practitioners on the ground, for diplomats trying to mediate, trying to find a commonality and convergences of views, such an environment makes the search for consensus, search for convergences all the more difficult. And I'm a little bit concerned nowadays, Jean-Marie, about how diplomacy is becoming even more like like there's like a running commentary on each and every step efforts that's being made, and those who in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we've always, most of the successes or the progresses that we have made have been done through quiet diplomacy, informal diplomacy, away from the limelight, where ideas can be tested, compromises can be reached. But now everything is done under full glare of public publicity. Even I mean, that image of the leaders of France and Germany heading to Ukraine, there is an inclination to proclaim to the world, here I am making my way somewhere. I know it's important to internalize it, to say that we are doing our level best, but does it actually serve the purpose of finding convergences and common solutions? I'm not so sure whether that will actually be the case. And certainly the point about the trust, we have had that our fair share of trust deficit in Southeast Asia as well in the past, but thankfully that's behind us, and now we are grappling with the trust deficit amongst the non-Southeast Asian countries that are being infecting our region, and therefore we are trying to address that. But to your question, I think there is scope and room for, I'm not going to use the term a third way, but at least a bridging role by someone, a group of countries that without prejudice to the other's position and with full respect to each other's position, there has to be some countries that plays a bridging role, and not to simply magnify and further solidify known divisions, which we all fully respect. But when all is said and done, these conflicts must be managed, must be brought to an end. And you look around the world, like on Syria, for instance. And now the conflict in Syria is now no longer in public domain, in public concentration. But how many years that we had allowed to lapse for this conflict to continue on and on and on, because of some debate somewhere about who should be attending or not attending a certain conference. I think in diplomacy, one must, emotion is not policy. Someone must have the role of trying to bridge the gap, and I'm hoping that we can continue to invest our hope in the United Nations. But the way it is, how it is at the moment, not United Nations as a body, but the member states within the United Nations conduct, then it is not too optimistic. Yeah, but to your specific question, therefore, Jean-Marie, I think there is scope for not one of those big ideas in terms of because I don't think we are seeing a world that is permanently align one group or the other like we were in the Cold War, but it is certainly issue dependent. Certain issues will have certain alignment, certain constellation of countries, and there is always a role for a bridging role by someone, a group of countries, to try to bring divisions into greater compromise and greater consensus. Diplomacy matters, and I feel that at the moment it is in a very fragile state. And just one very quick point, John Maria, I forgot, I meant to mention it before, about this prevention mentality, how we can prevent conflicts from flaring in the first place. Once a conflict erupts, obviously there is a role for diplomacy to try to bring it to an end. But the prevention outlook is extremely challenging because no country want to, multilateralize its problems globally, even before it begins, and therefore a prevention mindset requires a very well-calibrated, quiet, away from the limelight type of approach. But otherwise, countries will feel that their shortcomings are being brandished, is being publicized to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to have enough time for the questions, but before that, I'll give the floor to Andriy, and if you can, in a concise way, so that we have time for the questions, pick on any of the issues that have been discussed that you want to address.
We'll do my best. First, I would like to pick up a little bit on what just Mr. Natalegawa said. I think there are always bad sides to this new style of diplomacy, and I think many good people should be terrified with this new style. But this is the way it is. It is going to be for some time. With the social media, with TikTok policy, we should just, if not embrace, just to acknowledge and accept that this is the way the global policy decisions will be made in the nearest future. More ideological, this is the way it is. And we should just have to live with it. And there are good and bad sides to that. Second, going back to the big question, the panel on the role of international organizations. Here's one example. The Red Cross was heavily criticized in Ukraine for not being able to organize evacuation of refugees and exchange of prisoners. And I remember this disastrous interview by a Red Cross representative who, after 2 weeks of fighting, could not explain why they were not able to organize the corridors. And the Red Cross said, well, we cannot. You, Ukrainians, should negotiate directly with Russia. We cannot do anything with that. Instead, we will bring some food and water. And that was broadcast live by all the Ukrainian channels at that time. And I think the nation was just shocked. And we were saying, come on, we have so many organizations working on that, on food and on medical supplies. But you, in the Red Cross, you have very special mandate to protect the victims of the war, including the refugees, civilians, prisoners. You get a lot of resources for doing that. And why can't you do that? So I think the international organizations must remind themselves what they were designed for. I remember watching this movie, Hotel Rwanda, and it's a very heartbreaking story about the events in Rwanda. And I was thinking, well, those people in Rwanda, they are praying that the blue helmets will step in soon, in 2 weeks or in several days. But in Ukraine, it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen until Russia has a veto right in the UN Security Council. And if the United Nations cannot fulfill its mission to prevent wars from happening or stop the wars, then why should it continue running? This is the time to turn the tables. Either we change it or we should start something new. So I think one big answer is very obvious. We should go back and remind us what those big international institutions were designed for. And one last comment. I just saw this UNICEF job hiring announcement. They're looking for their new communication director in Ukraine. And the job requirement is speaking English and speaking Russian. And when you launch this announcement somewhere in Geneva or in New York, or I do not know where they are, what are you thinking about? How are you going to solve this biggest communication crisis in the history of international organizations here in our part of the world? When you want someone to deal with this without even speaking Ukrainian in these 40 million nations during the war. So I think we should go back to the basics. We should remind ourselves what those big international institutions are designed for, and they have to adjust to the reality on the ground.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to open to collect questions, and then the panelists will pick whichever questions. So let's start on the left and then we'll go around. And introduce yourself for the panelists so that they know.
Good morning. My name is Isis Gonzalez. I work at the Permanent Mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the UN. So I will focus mostly on Latin America. Thank you so much for the thought-provoking panel. How would you assess the result of the Summit of the Americas, and to what extent was the poor results as a result of the exclusionary approach to the planning of the summit? Also, how can we solve problems by exclusion? I see this as a trend now, exclusion. And can we really solve problems this way? Also, another theme was impact of domestic politics on foreign policy. And I heard the distinguished panelists from Indonesia say that emotion is not policy, but I would say perhaps voters' emotions or constituents' emotions seem to inform policy a lot. So that the impact here, I think, was a factor in the US choice to exclude 3 countries from the summit. Then there's the question of Mexico, for instance, the president not attending. How can we have a meaningful result coming out when immigration is a key issue and you don't have Mexico represented at heads level there? I would not blame AMLO though. It's a principle that was put forward that it should be inclusive, not an exclusive summit. And on the other side, of course, there's a principle too, that the US says they will not include countries that are not democracies, that are not functioning democracies in the eyes of the US. The problem though is that we have politics, we have principles, and we have a little bit of hypocrisy because we are willing to engage with other countries around the world that are not functioning democracies.
Thank you.
So how do we square that?
Sorry. Thank you very much. And please be as concise as you can be so that we have time for solid answers from the panel. So that's it. So the table in the back, yes.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Quinn from the Permanent Mission of the United Kingdom to the UN. A question for Haile Menkerios, if I may. Excellency, I'd be interested in your views on the AU's relevance versus the sub-regional organizations and regional mechanisms, and also your reflections on Chairperson Faki and President Macky Sall's recent visit to Sochi, which I think the outcomes of that were widely viewed with dismay outside Africa. But do you think, from their perspective, was it a successful trip in terms of African aims? Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. My name is Chris. I'm an American diplomat, US diplomat, and I've served our country in Haiti, Cuba, and the Office of Mexican Affairs. My question is for Ambassador Valdés. Ambassador, you mentioned that the United States has no time for Latin America, which is a sentiment I've heard before. What type of engagements would you like to see to change the dynamics of the relationship with the United States? Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists. My name is Henry Bergard. I work for the UN in Colombia. And my question is that we've heard about a number of options by which these countries could be working together. We've heard of against, the breaching of norms. We've heard of diplomacy, UN or institutions, norms. coalitions, public opinions could be used. We haven't heard much of what would be, and I'm thinking of what ISIS mentioned, like what are the responses? No, are there sanctions? Are there what are the other tools? And I'm curious to see how can countries and regions resist these big, powerful, dominant countries. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ivana de la Puente, and I'm also with the UN Verification Mission in Colombia. I had two quick questions. One for Martin on Asia, on ASEAN. And as you mentioned with Myanmar, I mean, I was working there in 2012 when the Rohingya crisis started, and ASEAN was very reluctant to be engaged. And I think Indonesia was one of the few ones that was willing to engage a bit more. But you mentioned that it was also an opportunity, and it has been open now more to work on the portfolio around peace and security. And I would be interested to hear how you have seen that being shaped. And I think there are some lessons learned there in ASEAN that I think Latin America could also take, particularly in a concept that we discussed yesterday with Ambassador Mohammed of the African Union regarding moving from the non-interference to the non-indifference concept. And then the other questions on Latin America, I haven't heard on how you perceive the role of the Organization of American States, if it's an organization that we should just consider that it didn't work and it's not working, or if you see any hope to retake it. And primarily, for example, we work on the peace process in Colombia, and as Latin American countries were very involved during the process, now in implementation, really, we haven't seen much engagement. And I think I'll be also interested to hear from you, how do you see the role of Latin American countries in the Security Council, given we have 2 seats, but it seems that we don't really act or use that privilege that we have to have those seats there. Thank you.
Desiree from Angola. I would like to, actually I wanted to have a little bit background, but anyways, I'm gonna concise my question. I would like to refer to the regional dynamics and precisely on the last resolution of the UN Security Council on CAR, and the importance that they highlighted. Okay, they highlighted the importance of regional efforts on the coming up with a roadmap, and which is a good thing, I think. And also the African Union recently held a summit on terrorism and constitutional changes of regime in Africa. So those are important steps that Africa is trying to put together to resolve some of the problems that we have. So I would like just to take advantage of Mr. Shevchenko. He's a very inspiring formulation, and said that we are not alone, but we feel a bit lonely. So that being said, having the Security Council as broadly the body responsible for peace and security in the world, and Africa being taking a large part of the Security Council's agenda, what would be the panel's view on how the UN can support more the efforts and the dynamics which are taking place in the continent, in both regional and AU at the AU level?
Good morning. This is Martin Valdés from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations. I wanted to pick up on the sharp comment of Andriy Shevchenko regarding communication. And my question goes to all panelists. With the Ukraine, I think we're seeing the first real life TikTok war, and we can currently follow the supposedly 12-hour-long ride of Chancellor Scholz and President Macron to Kiev. Is this instant way of communication that we are seeing helpful or unhelpful in diplomacy in the 21st century? What's your thinking, and whether you have any lessons learned on that? That would be extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, this is Jelena Goroska from the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. I also have a question for Mr. Shevchenko, and we talked a lot about the importance nowadays of public opinion and on convergences of opinions, but also the difficulty in sort of search and fostering a common identity. So I just wanted to see and ask, how do you see the role of the Russian speakers in Ukraine right now? And is there a role for them to play in this constellation where public opinion matters also domestically?
Thank you. I think I collected all the questions. So we have 10 minutes or so, which is not a long time to address all the questions. So I'll start in the inverse order and ask Mr. Shevchenko to address the questions that was addressed to him and any other question you would like to address.
I'll just continue saying that we are witnessing and will witness the diplomacy radically changing. I think the coronavirus and the quarantine damaged badly the conflict resolution diplomacy. That requires a lot of face-to-face meetings, face-to-face communications, and we had to adjust and to adapt. So I'm just saying it's not just about the war in Ukraine or about other things. There are things which will make this craft change dramatically. And I think we should be prepared that public opinion will matter the most. The reaction will be very quick. Right now in Ukraine, we say, and those might be bad jokes, but I'll share them, to Schultz something, which means to promise something and not deliver, and to Macron somebody, which is to call somebody without a clear reason. And I'm giving this not as an example of good joke, but as an example of very sharp and very painful things which might come from public opinion, and that will be part of the craft. And on the Russian speakers, if I heard correct, well, we are and will be a multicultural society. So I think Ukraine will remain that.
Thank you. Marty, you had a number of specific questions addressed to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I guess the questions on Myanmar and ASEAN is an illustration of a phenomenon that I had used the term before, intermestic, the convergence of international and domestic issues. And ASEAN purposefully and deliberately have tried to develop a mindset whereby we can, on the one hand, respect the idea, obviously, of non-interference and sovereignty, but at the same time, develop what we call a community spirit, whereby internal developments of a neighboring state, that can have a regional impact, can become a source of concern and attention by the neighboring countries. But this is a process. It's not an event. One can simply legislate or promulgate such a mindset by the adoption of a declaration. It has to be through state practice and development of trust and comfort level. We were there initially with ASEAN and Myanmar, but somehow I think in recent years we have lost the script in a way, and we are back to where we were before, unfortunately, and that's how it has been. The other one on the issue of public diplomacy, I mean, internal pressures and all that, I think on the whole, it is a fact of life. Yes, of course, nowadays diplomacy is being conducted in full glare of public concern and attention. And it is, on the whole, I think it's a positive thing. It does give the diplomats, the practicing diplomats, a greater sense of urgency and relevance even to conduct its work. But I think when all is said and done, when the subject of trying to reach consensus, forging agreement, this is where there is some benefit to be had in working through this in a more controlled environment, because otherwise, it would be impossible to have like a running commentary as diplomats are trying precisely to bring this agreement to hand. And this requires actually, in some ways, some sense of discipline by the leaders of the countries themselves, which is for public domain and which is for actual, it's statecraft and not necessarily stagecraft. And I'm afraid that in recent, we have gone to the other extreme where there is a tendency to want to proclaim and that here I am important, I'm doing A, B, C, and D, when these things ought to be more in the domain a more controlled environment where agreements can be reached, and then inform and the public obviously will judge on the agreement itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Haile, you also had several questions specifically addressed to you.
Yes, given the time, I'll just touch on some of them. There was a question on the relevance of the AU versus sub-regional organizations. Here, sub-regional organizations have been very effective, particularly in those regions where there is Big Brother. In other words, in ECOWAS, where Nigeria has, except perhaps recently, played a key role. Many positions taken by ECOWAS actually that were effective. In Southern Africa also SADC has been effective. Central Africa, Eastern Africa, where there's it has not been that strong, simply because there isn't a country for stability, pushing for stability, for instance. The African Union having decided on non-indifference versus, in other words, regarding unconstitutional changes of government or intervention where a state fails to protect its people. This is a very progressive, in other words, position, something the UN hasn't done, something other regional organizations, to my understanding, haven't done. It's very, very good. And it has worked, actually, in curbing particularly the unconstitutional change of government. But it has been checkered. Again, Chad is, for example, taken as an example. Why was the killing of a president, unconstitutional change, actually coming instead of constitutionally the parliament taking over or appointing a new government? Why was it, in other words, not involved there is a question again. It goes to the chairperson of the commission, who is Chadian, who is a contender for presidency. And therefore it has been checkered, but it is a very positive position. Has the visit of the AU Commission head and the other gentleman succeeded in getting support for Africa? I got a message a couple of days ago that Africa is getting the food it needs actually to buy, is what I understood, but I don't have the details about that. I think I should stop there in view of the fact that we don't have much time and there were other questions.
Thank you very much, Haile. And now for the final words, Juan Gabriel.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief. The questions were very precise. I thank all of them. The first question referred to the Summit of the Americas. Let me give you my personal perception. I wouldn't use diplomatic words in this answer. Presidents came with a lot of misgivings to the summit and left quite satisfied. In that sense, I believe that the summit was a new beginning for new dialogues, and this is positive in terms of our relations in the hemisphere. With respect to the exclusionary approach, I think it was the last performance in which the Cubans will be excluded in a summit in the Americas, because the Latin Americans will not exclude anybody from the summit. And I think that the main reason was given by the president of Chile, who said, I would have loved to have the president of Nicaragua sitting in front of me and ask him why he was putting in prison people violating his human rights without respect to any international norm. And this was not possible precisely because he was not invited and he was not there. With respect to the US and Latin American relations, I think that what we have is it needs more attention, more respect in terms of the discussion of the topics that we are going to discuss, and a degree of participation which corresponds to the dimension and the capacity of the economies of each country in the hemisphere. It needs responses to situations which are intolerable, like the one in Haiti, which is horrible at present. It needs to address directly and with a very frank approach the type of problems that the Latin American countries have. But I think that today, for instance, hemispheric efforts to contain the price of food and fuel in the hemisphere, which include economic and political policies, is today a great opportunity for the relationship. Therefore, I think that the answers to the questions about Latin America and the US that I received are answers with a certain level of optimism and with a lot of, as President Biden said to us the last time we saw him, we have a lot of work to do. And it depends very much not only on the US, but it depends a lot on the will of the Latin Americans to work together. With respect to the international organization, it is clear that the Organization of American States is going through a very big crisis of credibility in the region, and it needs a complete reorganization. And I think that this was also mentioned during the meeting many times. And of course, the issue of communications, I thank very much this reference to statecraft and stagecraft. I think this is a fantastic way of putting what we are going through in terms of most of the performances in the world today. The importance of diplomacy increases with a situation like the one we have in the Ukraine. A war of aggression like the one that Ukraine is suffering excludes any diplomacy, and what we need is more diplomacy. What we need is more capacity to address these problems with cooperation and with understanding of the realities of the world today. Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for allowing me to participate in this excellent meeting.
Well, thank you very much, Juan Gabriel, for those final words, which couldn't maybe be a better conclusion to a training week on diplomacy. And thank you to all our panelists for very substantive contributions. I think we made the best of 1 hour and a half, which could have extended to much more, but thank you to all of you.